Hi, everyone. My name is Maria, and I lead our client relationship department here at Nomad Capitalist, and I'm joined by Javi today from our research team. Today, we're going to be breaking down one of the biggest misconceptions Americans have, and that is that they cannot have any tax savings. They straight want to focus on immigration and not really talk about potential tax savings they can have. But Javi's here to help me break down that myth. Okay, Javi, let's get started. We have many American clients that are coming to us, and they straight right off the bat want to focus on immigration. They want to know what their plan B option is, and they rarely want to discuss some significant international tax savings they could have because they're not ready, to give up their U.S. citizenship. They think that they need to renounce in order to have some tax savings. So tell me a bit more about what can we do for them. Americans, they're not going to renounce. They're not happy to give up their passport. So what are their options when it comes to the taxes?
All right. Well, that's an interesting, let's say, scenario. So hello, everyone, and thank you, Maria, for having me. Well, listen, I would say that the first thing I would like to mention for all U.S. citizens is while tax, let's say, strategies for Americans are more complex and there are definitely more angles to consider because of citizenship-based taxation, there is always room to save tax when you go offshore. So that's the first thing I want to mention. Now, in terms of things they can do, there is a great variety. So I would definitely break it down into three major points. Number one is using U.S. territory. So obviously Puerto Rico is the most popular one, but the U.S. Virgin Islands can also have certain benefits for the right kind of person. Then I would also mention the foreign earned income exclusion after that. And then lastly, if you find it interesting, we could discuss some corporate structures that work well for certain Americans under different scenarios where they could really optimize their taxes.
Okay. A little lifestyle change is needed, obviously, so they're not going to continue living in the U.S. full time. Tell us firstly about Puerto Rico. You mentioned that, and I think some of our viewers are fairly familiar with the concept of Puerto Rico. But tell us, what are the major tax benefits, who Puerto Rico could be a right fit for, and break it down a bit.
Well, listen, I would say definitely on the lifestyle side, just to touch briefly on that before getting into the taxes, I think obviously Puerto Rico works if you're into island living. So if you want that slower pace of life, and I'm thinking because a lot of our clients are retirees, so, Puerto Rico could definitely work for somebody like that. I think Puerto Rico could definitely work for maybe somebody who wants to date in more of a Latin American pool, a population pool. That could be definitely interesting. And obviously the main topic of this discussion, which is if you want to keep your U.S. citizenship and still have big savings on tax, Puerto Rico can work. So who can essentially save taxes in Puerto Rico? Obviously, each little case is different, and you might have a specific niche that you have that maybe there's something hidden in the laws of Puerto Rico that can help you. But overall, I'd say 95% of cases where Puerto Rico works is either, number one, people who are actively trading stocks or crypto.
Okay.
So Puerto Rico has a great deal through Act 60 where if you become a bona fide resident of Puerto Rico, and this is very important, bona fide resident, it's a legal term. It means that you have a closer connection to Puerto Rico than to anywhere else in the world, including the mainland U.S. So you do need to have your home there, your center of vital interest there. If you have a family, wife and kids, and the dog, they all have to go, everyone has to go to Puerto Rico. So there's really no major way in which you can have closer ties to the U.S. and then still claim that you are, let's say, quote unquote, a tax resident of Puerto Rico.
And family is obviously important.
Major. Family is major. I guess the one thing I've seen in through our research is the one thing the IRS has become more flexible on is banking. So for some reason, keeping banking ties in the U.S., if you have everything else in Puerto Rico, is still doable. I would still advise caution because it's something that is noted. But so far, we have seen a couple of cases where, you want to keep your banks in the U.S. because oftentimes you can make the argument that U.S. banks are, they have FDIC insurance. There's this, so there are legitimate arguments as to why you would keep the banks in the U.S. as opposed to Puerto Rico. But other than that, we've really seen that you have to move everything into Puerto Rico. So if you do things properly and you do become a bona fide resident of Puerto Rico, you are on the island the majority of the time, etc., and you've done everything we've talked about, any capital gains on personal property, so that means stocks, crypto, bonds, things of that nature, any capital gains that accumulate from the moment that you become a bona fide resident onward is taxed at zero.
Okay.
So it's the only
no capital gains.
So no capital gains, right? So it's really the only place in the world to a large extent Americans can go to and really minimize their capital gains down to zero.
Okay.
So that I think is the first major objective for those kinds of people. And obviously, Puerto Rico is a great option. The other scenario where Puerto Rico could be very interesting is also when you have an active business that provides a service. So for example, if you're a lawyer, you're an accountant, an architect, an engineer, you have a profession and you provide some kind of service. Maybe you are a marketing agency or something of that nature, and you provide an intangible service to clients in the mainland US, in Canada, in Europe, wherever it is. You could set up a company under Act 60 Puerto Rico. The company itself would be taxed at 4%.
Okay.
That could be dropped even to 1% if it's very innovative, but that is subjective and very few people get that rate. But overall, 4%.
So worst case scenario, 4% basically.
Yeah, it's the standard scenario is 4%, and then exceptional cases you can get lower.
Okay.
Certain very small businesses also get like 2%, but again, the general rate is 4%. And the good thing is, so it's a very low rate of tax, and then any dividends you take out of that company as a bona fide resident of Puerto Rico are taxed at 0. So it is also a good way if you're running an active business to move to Puerto Rico, relocate everything there, and then get tax-free dividends and a company that is very lightly taxed. So I think for most Americans out there, having a corp taxed at 4%, having dividends taxed at 0, and capital gains taxed at 0, I think that sounds like a blessing.
Yeah.
So it's definitely a good option to look at Puerto Rico. Again, could work for some other people for certain industrial cases, certain tourism cases, but they're more rare and they're more like ultra specific. Generally speaking, these are good options. Now, if you're not ready to move to Puerto Rico for lifestyle reasons, or you don't want to spend half your year on an island in the Caribbean, or you simply don't like the weather, or for whatever reason you feel Puerto Rico is not the right place for you, then, many people overlook that there's this thing called the foreign earned income exclusion.
Yep.
And I think that comes up a lot with clients.
Yep.
So the foreign earned income exclusion is a great way to optimize your taxes. So there is a lot of nuance to it in the sense where the income has to really be foreign earned. So if you are talking about dividends, if you're talking about capital gains, if you're talking about interest, these are usually things that are not included in the foreign earned income exclusion. Again, if you're in an ultra specific case where you can qualify as a professional trader or a professional in real estate and you meet the amount of hours, then sure, but those are very few people. So for the vast majority of the population, capital gains, rent, interest, dividends are not considered active income. So when you're talking about foreign earned income exclusion, you're talking about salary, you're talking about professional fees that you charge, and the work has to be performed outside the United States. Now, the FEIE, foreign earned income exclusion, is not insanely high, but it is something. So for 2025, it's $130,000.
Okay.
And you can still claim the standard deduction on top of that. So right now for a single person, if I'm not mistaken, it's $15,000 for 2025. So overall, by relocating offshore, you could exempt from U.S. taxation $145,000 in the year. And on top of that, you get an additional benefits here and there, like for housing and certain things that are a bit more complex to get into, but you have some additional benefits here and there. So overall, it's an interesting scenario to look at.
But if you have a family, for example, let's say your partner, can you employ the partner as a part of the structure, and then this person also gets 130 something thousand, or how is that looked on?
Yeah, so you can employ your children, you can employ your spouse, but, and there's a big but, the IRS really carefully looks at the fact that the family actually plays a real legitimate role in the business. So if for example, if I'm running a company and my spouse legitimately is a marketing professional and she legitimately is serving as the marketing director and her services legitimately warrant a payment of $130,000 a year, that's perfectly fine. There's economic substance for my wife to actually be serving on my board of directors or to be serving as my marketing director or something like that. But if, let's say, my wife has no qualifications for the position, in reality, she's not performing any work, if you're audited, that could be a major risk. And ultimately, they're not going to recognize that as a legitimate expense. And that could, potentially bring some problems on the FEIE side. So it's not as clear cut, but I would say definitely yes, if the family's performing legitimate work. If it's not the case, I would be more cautious.
Okay. What about on the business side? Is there something that we can consider if our clients are setting up businesses in different countries, whether it's a tax treaty or not?
Right. So actually, tax treaties are not that relevant for U.S. citizens. And the main reason for that is, unfortunately, the IRS is very clever. So I do have to admit that, they're in the dark side of the force, but they're very clever. And so what they've done is the U.S. has included savings clauses in all of its treaties. And so in a nutshell, a bit more, a bit less, what it means is U.S. citizens cannot apply for treaty benefits when they relocate to different countries, other than certain very specific things, like usually Social Security income or things like that. That could be subject to some kind of treaty benefit. But overall, when you move to another country as an American and you say, well, it's a treaty jurisdiction, I want to claim the treaty benefits, there's always that little clause there that says the U.S. reserves the right to tax citizens as if the treaty did not exist.
Okay.
So unfortunately, treaties are not going to be a major difference. But what is a major difference is, number one, if you set up a tax neutral company, right, outside of the United States, and you're running your business through there, there are two things you have to consider. Number one, if it's a CFC or if it's not a CFC. So what a CFC is a controlled foreign corporation.
Okay.
So if we're lucky enough, and we've had clients that are in this position where you have a foreign business partner, right? So we recently had a client who was American, and I believe his business partner was Australian or Canadian, was one of those two. And so the partner owned 50% of the business. Because the American owned 50%, right, and did not own more than 50%. That's very important. So Americans can own up to 50% of a foreign company, and that wouldn't be considered CFC. The moment an American owns 50.1%, it's a CFC. And this involves both the voting rights and the economic rights in the company. So if it's not a CFC, you don't have to worry about any inclusion rules. So no GILTI, no subpart F, which is great. And therefore you can retain earnings in the foreign company. And you only have to worry about, as an American, taxation when the dividends are taken out. And the good thing is your own company can still pay you a salary, and that can be FEIE. So you can claim the foreign earned income exclusion, again, just to clarify, as long as you're 330 days outside the U.S. So you do have to spend a lot of time outside, or you really have to be a bona fide resident of another country or country. So you really have to show the U.S. This is more a subjective test, more difficult to prove. The benefit is you can spend a bit more time in the U.S., but you do have to show that you're legitimately a resident of another country, that your life is in another country or countries. So that is option number one. If you're lucky enough to have a foreign business partner, avoid CFC.
But not everyone has.
Yeah, unfortunately, not everyone has. Maybe you have other American business partners, or you're a one-man show. We have a lot of people who
a lot of clients are
who are one-man shows, and so they're the only owners of their business. When that happens, then unfortunately, you will have a controlled foreign corporation situation, and those can be very tricky.
Yes.
Those can be very tricky, and then you have two things that you have to look out for. Number one is, do I have any subpart F inclusions? Now, I'm not going to bore people with the whole legal explanation because it is very long, but generally speaking, subpart F can be avoided. If I oversimplify, subpart F can be avoided if you're running an active trader business and you're servicing third-party clients. So if your business is active, so it's not an investment company, you're actively providing a service or a good, and you're only dealing with legitimate third parties, so people who you are not related to, usually you don't have to worry about subpart F. Right? So subpart F is out. You would only have to worry then about GILTI. So GILTI is much newer. So the Global Intangible Low Taxed Income Tax, GILTI. It was introduced, actually, oddly enough, by Donald J. Trump during his first term. So the TAGJA, Trump Tax and Jobs Act, he introduced this GILTI provision. And so unfortunately, again, very complex. So what it does, it looks at the business and it says, okay, we're going to look at all of the tangible assets in the business. So that means offices, computers, trucks, machinery, things like that. Everything that is tangible and specifically that is subject to depreciation. They're going to look at that and they're going to say, okay, what's the value of all those assets? So let's say you have a round number, $1 million in tangible assets. The IRS will let you claim $100,000 and exclude that from GILTI. So 10% of the value of your tangible assets. So that is a way you more or less start saving on tax. If you have a tangible heavy business, like if you're running a hotel or you have a factory in another country, that could be very useful on the US side. And then the other thing is that anything in excess of 10% would then be subject to the GILTI inclusion. But if you set up a holding company in the US, tax as a C Corp, spare you the details, but you get a 50% discount. So ultimately, when all things are considered, you get the little 10% discount at the beginning. You get FEIE as the director of the foreign company. Your holding company can then receive that income. And overall, if you do things right, that would be subject to around a 10.5% tax, maybe a bit less. It is very tricky, and there are a lot of steps to doing this right. But very possible. So overall, you could have an American that ends up in the low single digits, like somewhere 8 or 9%. When you look at the whole structure, you could end up at 8 or 9%.
And this person would be paying approximately how much in let's say California.
Wow.
Or somewhere where many of our clients come from.
So New York and California, I'm just so sorry for you guys. Like, honestly, like, we love you, but please leave California and New York as soon as possible. I mean, honestly, you know, in California.
And don't go to Florida. Try something internationally for a change.
Yeah, it could be an interesting, of course, that's a very interesting approach. And so California, New York, I mean, you could very easily be in the high 50s, very easily.
Compared to this 8, 9, maybe 10% that you're talking about.
That you're talking about living abroad, even if you don't have any foreign business partners. Now, it is important, and to emphasize what you were saying earlier, for this strategy to work, you really have to be performing your business activities outside the U.S.
Okay.
So it doesn't work if you set up all the structure and then you're just in a computer in Brickell, Miami, doing everything.
It doesn't work like that.
It doesn't work.
Why I'm asking about these calculations is because obviously, you know, going through this journey is going to cost you money to invest into everything. It's obviously going to be, you know, tricky to do research about your kid's school to figure out what they're going to do if you leave the country. But overall, it sounds like it's going to be profitable at the end of the day, especially if we're talking about that big of a difference between 8, 9, 10% to maybe 50.
Of course. And even potentially zero, because if you have the foreign business partner, or if your business is small enough where you can zero it out between you and your wife through the foreign earned income exclusion or something like that, or maybe you have a kid that can work in the company legitimately and can also claim FEIE. So overall, there are certain scenarios where you can still pay zero.
Okay.
Relatively difficult to get there, but it's possible. And then there are scenarios where you can pay very, very low. What I would say, and we've helped a lot of clients do this, is it's crucial for Americans to relocate to jurisdictions that are tax neutral.
Okay.
Because that way they only have to worry about the U.S. Okay. So, you know, I'm a big fan of Panama. I just came back from Panama. I think it's a great place for Americans who really want... For Americans who want to go to Florida, but they don't realize that they can save more taxes elsewhere.
Okay.
Panama, definitely a great place. You know, major shopping malls, SUV culture, barbecues, all of the Florida living, but with better tax incentives. And then for people who want to live in Europe, there are also great options in Europe. Yeah. Here, where we all in Malta, it could potentially be tax neutral for the right kind of person. So overall, I would emphasize that point also.
So what's not tax neutral? If an American is going to like Germany or the Netherlands, that wouldn't be tax neutral.
You know,
right?
the most common one we see is France. If an American moves to Paris, we can do the whole structure, right? We can do guilty, FEIE, everything. And you can potentially save some money on the US side. But then France will come in and say, sacré bleu, alors, you're not paying taxes over there. You're going to pay taxes here.
Okay,
and so
it's not just about leaving the US. It's also about figuring out what is the right country to go to land.
Correct. So definitely France, not a great option to become a tax resident. Netherlands, you mentioned, no. Germany, no. I guess if you really want a continental European country, you could look at Switzerland is interesting for the right kind of person. Expensive to move to, involves careful planning, but can be possible. And you can get zero tax in Switzerland if you have the right type of income. Spain under the Beckham law. We talked about the Channel Islands, Jersey, Guernsey. Potentially Sark, if you're really an introvert, could work. Malta, where we are now. Cyprus, potentially. So there are definitely very interesting options.
Okay, and all of this is without renouncing your U.S. citizenship. Right. You will have, although some complex reporting requirements, I would say, to the U.S., right?
Definitely. So you do have to keep in mind that you have to file your 1040 every year. So the fact that you have the foreign earned income exclusion, the income is not taxable, doesn't mean that you don't have to report it. So your 1040 is still a requirement every single year. On top of that, if you own a foreign company, you do have to file your 5471 every single year. You have to comply with your FBAR also, and any additional like reporting requirements that you may need for your foreign bank accounts and things like that. You always need to make sure the IRS is fully aware of what you're doing.
It is a bit complicated, but definitely worth it. And you know, I've been in the company for about 3 years, and when our clients go through this plan creation process with the strategy team, you kind of have to lay everything down on a piece of paper where it's about cost of living, cost of the whole strategy to leave. But then at the end of the day, the tax savings that you're going to have to be worth it. Like it has to really make sense, right?
Correct. And then there's also the elephant in the room, which is very interesting, which is what Donald Trump said during the campaign, that he pledged to end double taxation on Americans. And many of our clients have said, well, then what would be the point? And I would say, well, what would be the point? That if Donald Trump actually gets this through, assuming Republicans in Congress play ball, and you are no longer subject to citizenship-based taxation, or not to the same extent, then that means that an American can now move to Panama and pay zero. Yeah. So even if Trump gets this and you're like, okay, well then what is the point? No, it becomes even better. It becomes even better for you to actually keep your U.S. passport like Europeans do, like Canadians do, and just move to Panama, move to Singapore, move to Hong Kong, move to Malta, and potentially pay zero or pay 1%.
Yeah, obviously we can still consider renouncing if that's what you want to do. And that can be part of the conversation if you don't want to go through this complex reporting and you really don't feel like you want to be an American anymore. But it seems like they do have many options if they're not going to renounce.
That is 100% correct. From Puerto Rico to corporate setups to finding a foreign investor to be part of the business, definitely multiple options that do not require renouncing U.S. citizenship. And I would add that U.S. citizenship renunciation is a very personal decision. I think we want to clarify that we do not encourage people to renounce. It is something that is deeply personal and something that you at home have to make that choice. And then if you want that, you may want help with execution, but ultimately the choice is yours. It's a very personal decision.
Yeah. And I have one question for you, Javi, because many clients ask us this throughout the process. And that's like, when is the right timeline to do this? What is the right time for me to decide to leave for tax savings or to leave for a better lifestyle for a family? And from your experience, and you've been here for quite some time now as well, what would you say is the right time? Does that really depend on some geopolitical, situations? Does it depend on how big your business is? What would you say regarding that?
So if you decided to do that yesterday would be great. Today is okay. Tomorrow may be too late.
Yeah.
So, I think that it is definitely important to have those structures set in now. And I can say that from personal experience, being from Venezuela, a country that has been so, turbulent these past few years. I can say from personal experience that my family and I have survived because since the pre-Chavez era, we've had offshore structures put in place that protected us and insulated us from the changes. So obviously, I'm not saying the U.S. will be Venezuela by any means. I think they're still very far from that. But, unforeseen political events or natural disasters or whatever it is can take place at any time. And so it's better to have those structures already in place and to say, maybe it's there and I'm not using it, but it's there. And when I need to use it, it's ready to go. It's like your bug out vehicle, so to speak, than to not have it. And then once the wave comes out, you realize you don't have a lifeboat and you are basically lost. So my advice would be get those structures in now, do everything you can now. Today's the day, tomorrow may be too late, and then you're going to be happy. It's like having an insurance policy, basically.
Yeah. And also, it sounds like leaving the U.S. for tax savings is one of the reasons. Doesn't really have to be the scenario where you're going to live in some deserted island. You mentioned some pretty good countries. You mentioned Switzerland, you mentioned Malta, where we are today. You mentioned obviously Panama, other European countries. But it really doesn't have to be to what some people would imagine back in the day, where it had to be, Cayman. It had
a beach.
Malta has beautiful beaches where we are right now, but generally it doesn't have to be some off the grid type of lifestyle where you're just by yourself and you're doing this for some tax savings.
No, definitely. I think that if somebody wants a big city, just off the top of my head, you've got Singapore, Panama City, Hong Kong. All of those can be very tax friendly. Madrid, for the right kind of person, or Barcelona can be tax friendly. Zurich can potentially be tax friendly. Geneva. So you do have options. If you want to have more of an isolated lifestyle, if you're an introvert, you can go as far as Sark. And live with 500 people in an island where you don't have cars, or you can go to the old school Cayman Islands. So obviously the good thing about this, and what I really take away from what you're saying, is you have options. Whether you want the big city, whether you want rural areas, whether you want the beach, whether you want the mountain, there are options all over the world that can be tax friendly.
Yeah. And it seems like the research team, and yourself included, are working on probably 100-something jurisdictions around the world. Obviously, not all of them are going to be a perfect match for every specific line that we're working with, but it seems like there's a lot of options. And obviously, we as a company want to be diversified in all of them. So that way we can offer more options to the people that come to us.
Yeah, no, definitely. I would say that there are jurisdictions so I would classify them in three categories, right? There are jurisdictions that are very tax friendly and where people actually actively move to. So I would say Spain, Switzerland, Panama, those places that often come up because most people would feel comfortable there. There are jurisdictions that simply do not work because they're not tax friendly at all. And so, why bother? We have the research there, but nobody's going to go there. And then we have those options that are tax friendly, but only work for very specific types of people. So I would say, again, SARC comes to mind. Paraguay is another one. Territorial tax country. Can be tax friendly, but I haven't found that many people who like the lifestyle in Paraguay. Maybe a bit isolated, not as developed, so very up and coming. But we have had, I think, one or two guys that went down there. So
Yeah, I think everyone is different. It's just important to know that you do have options, whether you're going to renounce or not. Obviously, we have to figure out what the right scenario will be. But it sounds like we have options. And at the end of the day, even if your pain points, it is to go in a direction of tax savings, it doesn't really have to be only about that. We can talk about safety. We can talk about, healthcare.
Asset protection is a big one. Yeah. Like, for example, many Americans come to us, they're concerned about asset protection. And you can confirm that from your side as a client relationship team lead. I mean, the U.S. is one of the most litigious cultures in the world. Like, honestly, as an attorney, it's fascinating to look at it because you have a lot of case law, but at the same time, you see so many lawsuits for things like slip and falls, or the cup of coffee was too hot, or something like that, that simply, that doesn't happen in other jurisdictions, right? And so...
Don't mess with my coffee.
Yeah, don't mess with my coffee. And so one of the main things that I would think of is, Americans, they want to have a bit more privacy. They want to have a bit more of that asset protection to make their assets harder to get from creditors in the U.S. And definitely having that offshore structure is crucial. So a lot of Americans talk about Wyoming. I have nothing against Wyoming. Interesting place to incorporate for certain people, particularly if you're not an American. But ultimately, I mean, the privacy laws you have in Switzerland, in Panama, and in certain other jurisdictions just are immensely interesting, especially if you're an American. It can really put your assets, at least, if not beyond the reach of creditors, they can make it much more difficult for them to reach them. Yeah.
I mean, asset protection is part of what we talk about in the whole process. If you come to us and you want us to deliver this holistic plan. So it's good that you mentioned it. It always kind of starts with a tax conversation. Kind of that's the focus. But we have a lot more to offer, basically.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Offshore structures for asset protection or operating companies, banking around the world. So if you're worried about bank failures in the U.S., we know a lot of people, don't trust U.S. banks these days. Some people do, some people don't. It's up to you to decide. But if you don't, know that the U.S. is not the only place to bank. There are very good banks in places from Panama to Uruguay to Switzerland to Singapore. So, ultimately, the world is your menu. And that is the important thing. And that does not exclude Americans. Americans maybe have, a heavier load to carry. But still have options, definitely. And as U.S. tax policies evolve, again, I'm very motivated to see what Trump does in his second term, because again, I would insist on this. If he somehow either minimizes or full on eliminates citizenship-based taxation, it'll be a great opportunity for Americans to go abroad and to internationalize more. And those who already have the structures in place are going to benefit from this much faster than those that are there.
I was just about to say that. Don't wait for any announcements and to figure things out, because even if you start today, we're going to figure out a strategy that's going to be fairly agnostic of whatever happens. And then if you start planning ahead, you're going to be in a better position, basically.
Exactly. So you're good either way. So worst case scenario, nothing changes. You're paying 8-9% overall. Best case scenario, citizenship taxation goes away. You're paying 0.
Definitely sounds interesting. A lot of options to consider. And if you want help with figuring out what your plan should be, you can reach out to our team at nomadcapitalist.com/apply.
Remember, drop a comment down below, subscribe to this YouTube channel, follow us on Instagram. We'll see you in the next video.
This is an 18th century palace in Lisbon, Portugal, and it's literally one of the most elegant fine dining restaurants anywhere in Europe. And I'm going to be showing you luxury living in Portugal here, and showing you penthouses and palaces for sale that you can live in with some of the best views of the city. And taking you to an exclusive members club that you can join, where old money and new money meet here in Lisbon. We're shopping for top brands along Lisbon's 5th Avenue, visiting a catamaran in Lisbon's harbor to show you how you can buy a boat here, and meeting Michelin star chefs and drinking amazing Portuguese wine to show you the good life in Lisbon. This is how to live like a king.